So now, good morning, everyone. No, good afternoon. Oh, good afternoon now. Thank you all for coming. First, we want to thank the travel committee because along with the Ollie staff, they have really helped us get this week off and going. So thank you. You all deserve a round of applause. So this afternoon, we're going to learn about the Baltic area region, where we're going to travel to in 2025. Registration for this trip is going to be next Tuesday, the 20th. Registration will start at 9 a.m. We have a different system what we're doing, so if you have any questions or anything about that travel registration, just stop in the Alley office and we can help you. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. This is travel guru Patrick Twomey, and he's going to share his knowledge with us.
How's that sound? Good. Getting it? Yep. All right. I feel like I should be guiding airplanes and you know, I might actually hold. Let's see. I don't know, I'll try and if it falls off, I'll leave. So. Hey, good afternoon. Thanks for having me down here to your beautiful state. It doesn't look like it did last year because it is so dry and warm out there. But it was nice to see the sun this morning, and it was great fun to enjoy the Super Bowl yesterday. It's my first Super Bowl ever in the United States. So it was, Sue's son was talking me through the game. I grew up with CFL, so 3 downs, not 4, and I kept getting confused. Why aren't they kicking? Anyway, we're going to go through the Baltic region a bit. Now, you've got a really interesting trip planned. It's a very, very interesting part of the world. As it's nice to see, by the way, so many familiar faces. It's fun coming back. Who's been up to Northern Europe? Some of you went to Helsinki last year. You've been up there. And you guys went down the coast of Norway last year too, didn't you? Yeah, and you told me earlier you had great weather in Bergen, that's the place that you're really crossing your fingers. It's 270 days of rain there. But when the sun's out, it's as dramatic as the world is. But I just thought as we talk about this broader area, I mean, it's a lot of different cultures that are squeezed into one region, of course. But I wanted to give you a little sense about where it is in the world. I know you know on the map, but to put a little bit of perspective, where we're talking. So obviously we're in Michigan here, but when you're right where we are, we're at about 43 degrees north right now, like right here in Saturn. So I think that's very interesting. Helsinki is just over 60 degrees north, right? So it's Stockholm, so it's Oslo. It puts in the perspective where it is in the world. The equivalent over here in North America, that's that high up, is Anchorage, Alaska. And again, I talk about this so often, but it's always so interesting to me when you look at our great big continents. Now, some of you were chatting earlier about the Canadian Maritimes. So I had pulled this map up earlier to show even Newfoundland, where people go to watch icebergs float down from Greenland. If you go over to Europe, Newfoundland is like the middle of France. And so it's an entirely different ecosystem when you're getting up into the Baltic and Scandinavia and the Nordic. They're way further north. But just in a macro sense of our world. So Newfoundland is 500,000 people. Now, 90% of Ontario, Quebec live in that Toronto to Montreal kind of area. You know, Winnipeg is about 700,000 people. Like, there's very little population north of it. So if you take that 60th parallel in our context in North America is the border with the territories up in Canada. That line is the 60th parallel. So that's where Helsinki is. So do you know all of Nunavut, the whole thing is about 32,000 people, right? And that's a territory the size of Western Europe. All of the Northwest Territories of Canada, Yellowknife, you might have seen last year the fires, Yellowknife actually had to be evacuated. The entire city, it's about 20,000. The entire territory is less than 60,000. And then you get over to Alaska and you're at about 750, maybe 800,000 people. So there are fewer than 1 million people north of 60 in North America. So then we go over to Scandinavia. Oh, and Greenland, by the way, is about 53,000 people. Iceland's 300,000. Then we get over here. So traditionally, I really like this room, but I'm going to have to move around a little bit with the computer. But traditionally, you think of Scandinavia are these guys: Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Iceland. The Nordic countries include Finland. You know, the Finns are not Scandinavians, right? And they're proud of that fact. And then you've got our Baltic countries here, and then I go to Poland, Germany. But this, depending where you want to draw a line, there's roughly, well, just shy of about 4 million, 10 million, 5 million, 5 million, 1.6, 2.3, 1.8 million, about 30 million people out there, the same level, more or less, as Alaska is in the United States. And it's really quite an incredible thing to think about. And then you throw in St. Petersburg in Russia. I mean, that's another 6 or 7 million people right there, right? And the most northerly ice free port is right here in Latvia. So all of this freezes over, but it's warm enough to sustain the kind of population it has because of the Gulf Stream, right? So we, over on our continent here, and obviously we're not having a normal year, but we have, like we talked about earlier, the biggest tides in the world, the Bay of Fundy, the second biggest in Anchorage. They're the cold flows, right? So Japan's got 125 million people. And yet, really, if you follow the line of islands, it goes right up to the Aleutian Islands. So that's the warm side, Japan, and then Scandinavia is the warm side. I mean, just think, this little island here, you might recognize it. But England, Wales, Scotland, just on this island are 60 million people. I mean, it's really rather incredible. And that's because the Gulf Stream, which comes down and then curves back up over Ireland and back up in this big arch here. Because of that Gulf Stream, you actually have incredibly moderate climate, even for these very northern areas. And given that, as we talked about earlier today, for 99% of human history, you basically ate every day what you could harvest. You either grew it or you fished it or you hunted it. And so that's why Little Ireland in 1839 was home to 8.5 million people because it was within a 10-degree bandwidth all year and the soil was productive. So they could produce food and eat. That's true when you get up to Scandinavia, more so in through Denmark, Stockholm, and southern Finland. Norway was always a bit more extreme. Now, Oslo is a fabulous city. I mean, of course, Norway is one of the richest countries in the world, but it sure heck wasn't 200 years ago. And if you go back to the Viking times, when Bergen was the capital, it peaked at about 14,000 people. Like, that's how isolated it all was. And life was hard because they lived in those gorgeous fjords. But as beautiful as your fjord might look like, it was pretty hard to live on. So obviously, as you know, I live in the Canadian Rockies and that same thing. The indigenous people who lived there for 14,000 years just used my beautiful mountain valley as a place to push bison into hunting, right? Because you're not going to live off the mountain. You're not going to harvest anything. You get the 2 months of berries. Right? But these guys had one great advantage year-round where they could fish. And fishing makes a huge difference. And if you haven't tried it yet, make sure to eat pickled herring when you're up there. I love this. And I love roll-offs, you know, around the pickles. Personal taste, but the Danes sort of bit, the Dutch actually, this one thing that is a little beyond me, but they take a herring, they just really oily fish and they dip it in onions, just, you know, pull all the meat off. Personal taste, right? But the rest of it I really do like. It's interesting, you'll have fun with the food. I don't think of that part of the world as much as a culinary destination as I do other places. But it is really a fabulous area. What I thought we could do is chat a little bit about the different countries, and then we kind of look through the itinerary that you're booked on, because you're going on the ship for this one. When you go on a ship, it obviously changes the game a little bit. But you are going to start in Denmark and in Copenhagen, the capital of Denmark, which is on an island. Are you aware of that? There's actually, mainland Denmark is called Jutland, and then you've got a series of islands, and Copenhagen's on this island here. But it's kind of no longer an island, which is a lie, of course, it's an island. But back 22 years ago, they opened a series of bridges. So now you drive all the way up and over to Sweden. You get to Gothenburg and all the way up to Stockholm. And in fact, there's a dialect spoken in this part of Denmark and southern Sweden. It's kind of a cross between Danish and Swedish. Identity. One thing, just to step back, say in a macro sense about this part of the world. People are extremely well educated. They are generally speaking wealthy. They are interesting and active, and they're also super proud. So, it's a very common thing when Copenhagen Airport people arrive, local people and friends are coming home, they all wave Danish flags to welcome people home. And I think it's just, they're part of the European Union. It's not that they think they're better than everyone. They're a little country, and they really care about themselves. And when I say that, Denmark specifically quite often rates as the happiest place on earth. And as I like to say, there's lies and lies in statistics, but it shows up most frequently as the happiest country in the world. They have 7 weeks of vacation. Oh, you can even imagine. But yeah, so that plays into it. Very, very small, low country, of course. They joke that if you have to talk to your neighbor on the other island, you stand on a building. And it's traditionally both Denmark and Ireland, the two most agricultural countries really in the European Union. So great cheese. But again, very high level of education, very relaxed. By the way, I'm glad that you're going on the ship. It's a great way to go and see Scandinavia, partly because Scandinavia is super expensive. And that's because, and again, we'll talk about the Baltic and everything will change subjects, but when I look to these countries, particularly, the costs, and Finland, the costs are very high. Taxation rates are extremely high. But this is their deal. They're considered social democracy, right? And it's a reason to travel there just to have the conversations. Basically, life in a place like Denmark is tax-free right up to university. No tuition or anything. Then in your working years, you pay a huge amount of tax, and then your retirement's taken care of. So that's the deal they've made as a society. And I do want to step back and make another kind of interesting point. So you're all familiar, of course, with the European Union. When I say, kind of the United States of Europe, although way less mobile than the United States of America is, because you can move from Finland to Spain tomorrow, or vice versa. The average Spaniard doesn't really speak very good Finnish, so it's a harder move to do, and vice versa. And they do have the same open borders. That's the Schengen Treaty. Schengen was a town in Luxembourg here. But if you look at Europe as a whole, so the UK is not in it, Switzerland is not in it. People sometimes ask me how I feel about Switzerland. I say kind of neutral. Yeah. But it's a country you can bank on. Oh, that's our Swiss. But if you take the kind of overall, so you've got Italy down here, so a little bit lower. Who do you think saves the most money? Which European nationality puts away the most of their income, regardless of what your income is? So let's see, you might know the answer. So yeah, so that's who saves? Germany?
Italy? Or Norway?
Norway. Now, Norway's not actually in the European Union. Yeah, but they're in the Nordic countries, so they're sort of in. And then while you're thinking about that, who saves the least amount? Who spends the most of their income? Greece. I love this conversation because it's the exact opposite. The Italians are the biggest savers, and the Danes save the least. And that's because the Italians don't have a lot of faith in their system because of corruption, historic, whatever reasons. So and of course, a lot of the economy, in particularly Italy, is kind of under the a black economy as we talked about it. And so the Italians have to watch out for number one, you stash some of your money. Whereas up in Denmark, everybody trusts the system. So if your paycheck is €1,000 a week, and on Friday night, after paying your mortgage or your bills or whatever, you still have €200, go out and have a party. Spend it because next week you'll make it again. Because they all believe that their system will be there for them later on in life. And that's why they're happy generally to pay all the taxes they pay. They still debate it. But I mean, my first time in Denmark, years and years and years ago, I was back here in Europe and stayed with a Danish family because of friends or something. And the young fellow was exactly my age group, university students. And he said, oh, I'm a member of the most conservative party in Denmark. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. You're talking politics. And I said, so what does that mean? I said, oh, I believe in the free market. I said, so like people pay for healthcare and education? Oh, no. No, it wouldn't be that. Oh, no. I'm like, okay, well, we probably agree on most things. But that was their vision of being, that. So that's just an interesting way, and it's just a factor of traveling in Scandinavia, and it's an interesting element. Now, small, not particularly diverse. They're getting a lot more immigration now. Smaller populations, you don't have the same movement. There's a lot of reasons, but there is a reason why these 4 countries and really 5 often rate, almost always rate at the highest levels of the human development index. And it's the HDI, if you're familiar with that. I really like the human development index as a tool because it's not just the richest. It's looking at 60 or 66 factors, which is everything from access to education, access to health, safe walking down the street, life expectancy. It's a great big picture. And that's where so often, Denmark, and then really the other countries that fall in quite often, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, like some of the countries you would expect, very low levels of violence. So that's kind of an interesting thing. So Denmark's an interesting place to come. And let's come back to these, but let's just kind of go through what you're doing. And it is fun to play around, but just in terms of that point of trusting the government with your money, and I did talk about this last year, so I apologize if you listened to me last year. Finland is almost always, if not always, considered the least corrupt country on earth. Transparency International, I just love those kind of organizations. I honestly think, corruption gets to the core of economic development. Another example I often give is there's 2 countries in Latin America where the police really aren't corrupt. Chile and Costa Rica. Guess which 2 countries are doing the best? Guys, if I have something go wrong at home, the first thing I can do is call them. If you're in Venezuela, the last thing you do is call the police. It makes a big difference. But Finland is so not corrupt. They used to publish a book every quarter. I think it's probably online. They actually publish what every person in the country earns. Now, why is social control mechanism? That's a competitive society, right? So it's a very unique culture, and the Finns are totally different people ethnically. But your neighbor is a hairdresser and earns 3,000 euros a month or something. Suddenly drives up with a brand new Mercedes. You say, where'd you get the money for that? And so they really know where their money is coming from and going. And so for a country of 5.5 million people, they're extremely successful at providing education and services. And then as a consequence, their old economy that was like all lumber. Finland had a pretty tough go until about the 1920s. And then they were invaded first by the Soviets and then by the Nazis. They defeated both, by the way, which is pretty impressive. The greatest sniper of all time was Finn. They call him the White Death. Not that I'd like to be a sniper as a job, but he was very good at catching up Red Army. But I mean, pretty poor, pretty rural, except for really Helsinki. And now, do you play Clash of Clans? Do you know the game on my phone? It's the only game that I have because I downloaded with my son like 10 years ago. It's one of those games. It's the only silly thing when I'm sitting around. That comes out of Finland. It employs like 50 people and makes $100 million a year. So it's that brain economy. Nokia was up there. Now Apple's already beaten Nokia. Ericsson was over here. So these kind of economies have shown the advantage of high levels of education and real work mobility. Because people feel like they can take the chance, because they know they've got their healthcare and housing if they need it, and they take chances economically. And this economists talk about this all the time. Why are these economies so successful? High taxation and not so much. But it seems to be because these businesses can do so well. Again, I think that's their debates. Yes, sir.
Just wondering, what are the levels of immigration into those?
Yeah, great question. I want to break that down between like the former East here, of course. Now that these countries are in the European Union, it's changing. It's a free movement of people. But from the eastern side of Europe, you've seen a pretty substantial move west. Like at one point in Little Ireland, there were 250,000 Poles working. Little town in West Cork. You came in and there was like about 12 years ago, so there's a Polish shop there. So you see that migration. Sweden would be the most international of them. So if we round it off to 10 million people, there's at least 1 million actual refugees that have gone into Sweden. So all these countries, the only countries in the world that live up to their commitment of 0.7% of GDP going to international development. So they're the only countries, but the immigration patterns are different in each country. So Finland is starting to become more diverse. Now I have to Google the actual numbers. Denmark is starting, it's had a couple of populist governments the last little while down, partly because so many immigrants didn't even learn Danish or Swedish. You can get by in English in all these places. But you'd be surprised. I mean, in Stockholm and in Gothenburg, which is right around here, probably 20% of houses would be either immigrants, but generally people come more in as refugees. And of course, Germany, right? The granddaddy of the whole thing, the biggie down here with 80 million people, just 5 years ago, took in 1 million Syrians in a couple of weeks. Whereas, like these guys, Hungary is on the edge of getting itself kicked out of the European Union because they're not living up to any of their obligations. So it will be more diverse than you might imagine. But absolutely, I mean, that's the part of the world where you see the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Scandinavians. And immigrants, of course, look forward to going up to countries like this because the standard of living is so high. On the other hand, you imagine coming from even here, and I know you can feel like it's quite gray in the winter. These guys in these cities, they're getting 2 hours, 2.5 hours of light. That's now summertime, you get the midnight sun. And there are strange things done in the midnight sun. But I mean, for gold. But so you do see that. Stockholm's the biggest city up there, and it is interesting because they've got a lot of that kind of functional 70s architecture. You're not necessarily going to see, you're coming on a ship, which is absolutely the best way to see Stockholm. Because it's the archipelago out in front of it, and so you wind into that's where Apple lived, out on those islands. It's just gorgeous. You get to the Gylmerstad, which is the old city. It's just so picturesque. It's beautiful. But when I've actually had a bit more time, now you get out to the suburbs, the average people live. You see this in Paris too. It feels like kind of housing projects and very distinct ethnic groups in different areas. So, and they do have. I mean, there are social issues occurring in Sweden. We always have to be. We all know this. We have to be so careful about the false promotions of this stuff too. They talk about this rise in violence in Sweden, and there have been some genuine kind of racial-based conflict things because they do have one movement that's just like Germany had it recently, where they want to kick all the minorities out. They never poll above about 10 or 12% of the population, but they can be quite violent, skinhead type. So that does exist, but it's still safe as can be. Now you come over to this side. So obviously, once upon a time, right, there was a border here. Berlin was divided. You all know this history, and there was Eastern Europe, and obviously Yugoslavia was a bit of a different story. But since the decline of the Soviet Union, since it fell apart, then these countries jumped as quickly as they could into joining Europe at these free trade deals and applying for the European Union. And in doing so, tons of young people migrated away. And that's why you see, and the 3 Baltic states, which I really want to get into in some depth, these are small populations. I mean, they were really getting to a crisis of saying, so much of our populations are moving away. How are you going to run a country? Like little Estonia is a really 1.6 million or something. But the other challenge to these 3 particularly, by the way, Belarus. Do you know anything about Belarus?
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah, Minsk. Have you spent time there? Have you spent time there?
No.
No.
I spent time in Lithuania and Latvia, though.
Okay, yeah, great. But Belarus is the last true dictatorship in Europe. He's not a nice guy.
Lukashenko.
Yeah, Lukashenko, exactly. And in fact, one of his critics was flying up to Lithuania. They downed the airplane, forced it down, saying that there's a bomb on board just so they could arrest him. And now he's disappeared. Yeah, I mean, you're going to skip Belarus. These countries, Lithuania or Latvia, I think, Lithuania was the first one when the Soviet Union started to fall apart. That 1989, 1990. And I am just old enough. I know I don't look it. I am just old enough that I once went to Leningrad. It was the last year in Leningrad before St. Petersburg. I had my 19th birthday at the ballet. Isn't that fun? Yeah, my mom always loved that part of the world. And so we flew up to Finland together, went in, and it was still like going into the Soviet Union. These, yeah, and then I ran a few tours there, and I saw the corruption in Russia was coming out. And they used to pull us over all the time, say, "Oh, you ran a red light," and there's no lights to pull over. And then they arrested me in the airport.
I was there
Yeah.
2 years after Soviet Union fell apart. It was still like, I mean, our tour guides were all ex-KGB.
Yes. Oh, I mean, yeah, it's a beautiful city, but it's changed so much. Both St. Petersburg and Moscow now, they're just clogged with traffic. In the old days, there was no traffic on the road. But these countries here. So, do you know anything about the Estonian language?
It's just like the Finnish. Actually, it's the northern version of the Hungarian, the Magyar.
Magyar. They're good man. So, linguistically, right? These guys are all the Nordic languages. And yes, Norwegian and Swedish and Denmark are different. They can understand. Right? They're really dialects. Iceland's really the oldest form of Norwegian. But Finnish, and this is why I say the Finns are Nordic, but they're not Scandinavians. Because the Finns, the Estonians, the Hungarians came from way over in North Central Asia. So they're Uralic peoples. And they migrated in here about 1,000 years ago, 1,100 years ago. And the Hungarians probably picked the toughest journey because they went right into this huge population center. Remember, these guys here in Ukraine were all cleared out by the Mongols when they came across, right? And then Hungary, Budapest, one side was the Turks and the other side were the Austrians. But their king, when they moved in as kind of a tribal unit, converted to Christianity right away. The Finns and the Estonians were this Uralic group, and their language. Those of you who went last year, you able to hear some of it? Like it's really you just don't recognize it. I think it's a lovely sounding. I really love it when you get the kind of sing-song Norwegian. You know, remember the Spanish or the Swedish chef back in the mountains? It's fun to hear. But the Finnish language is literally a language of few words. Like they just don't have a lot of words, but words have big meanings. Totally phonetic, but really hard for us. It's considered one of the hardest languages in Europe, as is Hungarian, as is Estonian, because it's not based as an Indo-European language. Unlike pretty much every other language in Europe has some roots from the Hittites that came up from what is now southern Turkey. So the Finns are unique people. Incidentally, we talked about it last year. You're not going on this trip. North of the Sami. You know them as Laplanders. You know, way up north. And fabulous people, and they're herding people, so caribou or reindeer. That's what they live off. But the Finns came all into Karelia here, this kind of lake district. Certainly the oldest evidence of skiing and skating is found in archaeological sites here. But of course, all that kind of lake frozen land is right across what is now Northern Russia. They used to skate on bones. And skis from the early days, from what we could tell about them, was one long thing with a big stick, like a punt, you know, but that's how they travel in the winter. So they've always been a Nordic people. And they are their own linguistic group. Latvian and Lithuanian are different linguistic groups. They're actually really closer to Polish in that area. But where I want to go with this is Finland walked this very fine line. So Finland was ruled for years as part of the Swedish Empire. So it is officially bilingual. So 92
part of Finland still has a lot of Swedish.
Well, they do actually. I'll get to that because it's an interesting one. I don't think I know you're stopping in Visby, which is here, but over here, Turku, which was the old capital of Finland, has a big Swedish population. But these islands are called the Öland Islands. It's an A with a circle. They are Swedish-speaking Finnish islands, and they've even got their own separatist movement going. They print their own money and stuff. Nobody really cares, but they actually live on those islands. And they ended up as part of Finland. So Finland is officially, you'll see bilingual signs everywhere, Finnish and Swedish. And of course, a lot of English. I mean, English is, the language of travel and money and so forth. But Finland managed to stay independent. So they were then controlled by the Russian Empire. World War I occurs, and Russia implodes on itself. 1917. Remember, it was only the 1880s that Russia actually liberated the serfs, which wasn't white enslavement, pretty close. You were tied to the land, to a lord. So they liberated them, but then they made them pay back their landowners. When you have nothing, you have no money to pay them back. So really, by the time you get to World War I, Russia is corrupt as can be. It's focused around the Tsar, and they're going to war with Germany, basically, Russian brigades running into battle out of trenches with no guns. Like, I mean, just how awful it was. So Finland breaks free. That's its opportunity. The Soviet Union collapses in on itself. Finland breaks free, and the Baltic states break free. So they become independent countries at that point. We'll get back to some of their older history, but they become independent countries at that point. Finland breaks free. Finland from 1917 to 1919 has its own civil war because they had a communist movement. Remember, that's what happened in Russia. It wasn't called the Soviet Union at that point. When the Finnish left, loses that battle, that's when you see Finnish migration into this part of it. So you get up into Minnesota, up in northern Sudbury, Ontario, big Finnish communities around there. They all date back to that time. Max outflow. Your other places in Minnesota where you get all the Norwegians and stuff, that tends to be a bit early. By the time you see the German migrations into this part of the world and everything, because things are quite cool. But Finland manages to become independent, and it just stands on this really weird line right up to World War II. But that's when you'll remember some of this history, of course, when Hitler and Stalin get together and decide they're going to split Poland. Remember that was their detente between like two horrible systems, but that also were diametrically opposed to each other. So they split Poland, obviously the invasion of Poland really keys off World War II. But when the Soviets move into Poland, they also move into Finland. And this is the kind of history that's not remembered as much. And this is what is so unknown. And the Baltics, yeah. The Baltics, they moved in pretty quickly. But they move into Finland. The Finns more or less defeat the Soviet army. That's how incredible they are. Now, they're fabulous outdoors people. They know their land, but it's lake country. It looks very much like your UP, that kind of thing. They defeat them, but they become allied with Nazi Germany to do so. Both Finland, and this is an important thing, it's another part of our talk, both Finland and Denmark refused to hand over their Jews. Right? The only countries in Europe. So very important. Now, they didn't have a big Jewish population for them, but nevertheless, they refused to hand them over. But they were officially allied with Germany. So they defeat the Soviets, and then they turn around and kick the Germans out. And then at the end of World War II, because they were technically an ally, they were forced to pay reparation payments. Now, we hear so much about reparation payments leading to World War II, after World War I. Finland's the only country to pay them right off. Right? And a lovely quote I like to say about Finland is, back when Gorbachev and Reagan had a summit there in the 80s, you might remember, one of the American journalists, of course, they were really about the summit, they said to Kekkonen, who was the president at the time, said, we don't know anything about Finland. Tell us about your country. Says, it's better if you don't know about us. Please forget about us. Because they were sitting, I mean, that is the largest western border of the Soviet Union. And this country managed to stay independent and have like a free market economy. And a pretty successful one. So Finland pulled that off, whereas nobody else, pulled that off. So they sat that way. So they and Sweden were very neutral countries, right? A bit like Switzerland was, but real neutrality. The other really neutral country in Europe is actually Ireland, because they won't align with Britain. They sat with that until last year, until the invasion of Ukraine. Finland and then Sweden both applied to join NATO, and they've joined NATO. So now the biggest NATO border with the Soviet Union is now Finland. And that was a huge switch. Now I'm really lucky. I have some Finnish friends. Almost all Canadians have Finnish friends, because we're the two countries in the world where the number one sport is ice hockey. So we just talk hockey all the time. And I have been back to Finland now for quite a long time. My wife was there for a conference last year and almost didn't go. It was a medical conference, but because they genuinely, at the start of Ukraine, they thought they were going to be invaded. I mean, they were literally calling people up. And Finns will stand and fight for Finland. And they were so, but of course, the Soviet army was proven to so totally, or the Russian army, so infected that now they're using up all the resources. So that's how Finland's kind of pulled through. But these three countries, so coming back to that period at the end of World War II, these ones get reabsorbed in the Soviet Union. So they have this little pocket between World War I and World War II, were independent countries. Then they were reabsorbed in. When the Soviet Union starts to fall apart, they all declare independence. But this is where everything becomes more complicated. In each one of these countries, about a third of the population are Russian speaking. This was another thing that happened in the Soviet Union, is they were, even though ostensibly it was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, Russian is the language. and they were moving Russians into all the areas to basically filter out the languages. All the countries that did become independent, like the Stems and all of that, were ones where still Russians were a distinct minority. So these countries jumped at independence, but then you get these people who are almost stateless, right? They're Russians, but they have an Estonian passport. But of course, Estonia then, declaring its independence, only offers services in Estonia, or Latvian or Lithuanian. So
Latvia was the biggest country with like 40% of the Russian population.
yeah,
I used to teach some of that stuff.
oh, good, yeah, yeah. No, it's interesting. I met
Lithuanian had the fewest Russian.
Yeah, but Lithuania, well, I'll get into some of the Jewish history there, but so you have this big population of Russians, really tough. And now, if you've been watching the last couple of years, it's been fascinating. So if you go to Tallinn, which you're going to, you'll be in the capital. Beautiful, beautiful city. Hanseatic, which we'll talk about in a minute. The Russian embassy that's there is covered in red paint. And I mean, these are the countries that are saying every day, we need to fight back at Russia because they know what it's like to be occupied and they're terrible. So yeah, that's been an interesting thing that's happened. Although it looks like now everything feels peaceful. I wouldn't be at all afraid to go. It was 2 years ago that everyone was terrified. Excuse me. Sorry, I just got back.
Those three countries
10 things.
in NATO, and there's actually U.S., French, German, and Polish troops in those countries.
Oh, I mean, there's Canadian troops up in these countries. Yeah, I mean, there's NATO troops all up here right now. And of course, I'm sitting with this Belarusian as well. And then, of course, maybe Poland. We'll get into Poland. Do you know this little place in Poland? Do you know? This is Kaliningrad. That is actually Russian, right? And that is a Russian warmer water port. But it's so isolated now, except for Belarus. It's so integrated. But yeah, and that's a no-go zone. It's really hard to get a visa to go in there. It's basically Russian military sitting in that little corner. So, but let's start to talk about your trip a little bit, just for the sheer fun of it. And it is, I like the look of it. The fact you've got the smaller boat really allows you to get in and do some of the things you can't otherwise do. Years ago, I did essentially this trip, a ship, but I think it had Oslo in it as well. But it was about a 3-week one that I did once, and I was employed to go on with a group and give a talk each day, which was great fun. And I got on the ship, and I did go a bunch of places at that point, and they said, "Oh, you're sharing a room." Well, it wasn't part of the contract. I shared a room with the priest for 3 weeks. He was retired. You know what? He was a lovely man. And go on as priest because he gets to travel for free. And I'd sit with him with maps because this is before I could Google anything. And I'm saying, well, where do we watch Saxy? I have a lovely time. We get long conversation, but it's a lovely thing to do. But starting there in beautiful Copenhagen, no one can ever tire of Copenhagen. It is just gorgeous. You're going to go out and see the lady out on the rock, Hans Christian Andersen. The city itself is there she is. The Little Mermaid, but that classic kind of architecture you get from that part of the world. Remember that Denmark is a kingdom. Did you know that? Yeah, and Queen Beatrice actually announced her retirement on either New Year's or Christmas Day this year. So yeah, so Copenhagen, as you'll see, it's all kind of canals. It was a very maritime country. What, just I remember in terms of area, what was Denmark's biggest colony? Remember, it was a kingdom. It was an empire, its own way.
Greenland?
Greenland, exactly. So Greenland, and Nuuk is the capital there. Greenland sits interesting because it still falls under the crown. But just like King Charles III is actually my king as well, in Canada, because we're still in the Commonwealth. So Greenland is not in the European Union. It's still part of the Danish sphere. There's one other Danish island. I don't know if you're familiar with this at all. Close. No, you're thinking Svalbard. No, it's over here. Right? No, it's further over. There, the Faroe Islands. They're gorgeous little islands, way up as you can see, and they speak their own language, Faroese, which is they understand each other. The whole island is tunnels. It's fascinating. The only thing is their national sport is to jump in the water and hunt dolphins by hand. I think they got bored. But yeah, they're way up there. That's all Viking stuff, right? And Denmark really wasn't a Viking country, but it's productive. Jutland, the mainland, really productive. So the food is good, but Copenhagen is just one of those livable cities. It is totally walkable. It is friendly. The Danes are tall. There are people I can look up to. The tallest people in Europe are actually Dutch. But all this sort of very tall people. But it's just lovely. If you have the energy or something, if you have some free time, one thing that's nice to do in Copenhagen is just to get a bike and go for a ride because it's just so bicycle friendly. So yeah, so if you like cycling at all, really, really easy to do. Tivoli are the famous gardens. That's kind of their amusement park area. It's right in the middle of town. But yeah, they have a royal family, and these guys have a royal family, what you're visiting. Finland's a republic. These countries are all republics, so they don't have royal families, right? So that's kind of interesting as well. So Copenhagen's a lovely place. It's lovely. I think you have a couple of days there. You do a bit of sightseeing. It's a nice itinerary. One of the things I really love about this particular trip is when you leave Copenhagen, you're going over this tiny little island here, Fjord. And I have not been there. So I've read about it before because I believe everybody on that island gets around on bikes. You know, dead flat, and you're going up to Visby as well, flat as can be. So you're really up in the Baltic there. But yeah, let me see if we can get it to come up. And then that's how small it is. It's still not going to be. But anyway, going to this tiny island. So that's the most easterly of the Danish islands. So that's going to be like, I think it's really fun stuff. Then you're heading down into Gdansk. Now, I don't know, some of you probably know a lot about Polish history. Is there Polish roots? Yeah, I always figured this part of the world, we've got a lot of Polish lines here. Yeah, East Prussia? Yeah. So Poland is, yeah, it was Danzig. It was the free port for many years. Poland has ebbed and flowed, and Polish history is worth, an actual university course because there's so much to it. But it's always sat, of course, wedged between a massive empire to one side, huge powers to the other. But Poland itself is still a big country. And it was a good agricultural country. It's got Carpathian to the south. It's smaller up top, or flatter and more agricultural along this whole area through here. But old Danzig was one of these free port cities, and that was after before World War I, sorry. Because after World War I, basically Poland comes back to life. Poland was peeled apart for about 400 years, partly because there were so many, during the feudal period, each lord actually had a veto. It's like a thing. Imagine if every state in the United States had a veto on anything. Someone's going to say no, right? And gradually, Poland just got eaten away because it wasn't functioning that well internally. And, very in the Polish history for a long time. But it comes back to life one in a bigger sense. Obviously, the collapse of what was that German empire, the attempt to have a German empire, which was very late to the game of colonialism. And so that's just kind of where Poland comes around. Gdansk, though, is really important if you get back in more modern history to Lech Walesa, the rise of Solidarity. It was 1980s. 1980s. It was, the early 80s, too. I think my first ever political act. So we were at Christmas at my grandmother's house and we put candles up in the windows. Remember, it was to show support for the Poles when they were standing up to the Soviet Union. Soviet Union, bad place. Yeah, and so they really broke away. And of course, an extremely Catholic country. You keep that in mind, because of course, John Paul II came from there. That was a big deal when he went and spoke. They still had a communist leadership. Do you remember? I don't know if you remember the film. So the pictures were neat. Like the cameras that scrolled out showed the leader, his leg was trembling as he was standing by. You could see it was, because all you need is the Pope to stand up and say to these people, time to rise up. And they did. That's some of the really neat side. I'm not even sure what you're going to do in Gdansk for David. Really neat historic city. And in fact, almost all these cities, so if you let us jump back to the 1200s, 1300s, and 1400s, basically the theme of the trip you're doing is the Hanseatic League. So excluding Denmark, all of these cities were trading ports at the very start of the rise of what became the Renaissance. The Renaissance, rebirth, where do you all in your hearts, where do you think the Renaissance started?
Spain.
Oh, I don't think so.
I think of it because of the learned parts of actually in the south where the Arabs were still.
Sure, but that's even a different story. But the okay, Italy, we hear about it so much artistic, and there's a very strong argument there. But really, I would argue or offer that the real Renaissance actually began in what is now Belgium, in the town of Bruges. Right? You've been to Bruges, I think, haven't you? I'll put Bruges on you. So what's that?
Only the moon.
Oh, then what? That's right. Yeah. So Bruges is just down here. I'm sorry, there it is. Bruges was a port, but Bruges is the first stock exchange in the world. People did trade stocks on a bridge in Paris, but Bruges was the first one. They were into lace trading. But again, that's because all of this was actually by the Spanish. So Bruges was again an independent city. That's really the birth of what becomes the rise out of those Middle Ages where really it was little feudal fiefdoms and everything to trade. And so you had this whole trade, the longest traded real estate, at least in the Western world, is the city of Amsterdam. Traded for over 800 years, bought and sold, which means house prices don't always go up. The average house would be $1 billion or something, right? But that's that kind of trading world, and it's made for it. Well, that whole Hanseatic League, all that early trade happened up there. And so what you're going to see all over the place in these cities are really lovely spires and that looks very, very Nordic style. Sorry, these just flick through, but they're fun to see. And then, so as you carry on along, I really love, let's see, better ones here. Yeah, so you get so many interesting spires. There you go. That's very typical Hanseatic architecture. So one of the real treats, because these cities, both during the wars, many of the ones of the Baltic and everything, they really fell quite quickly and were liberated quite quickly. So a lot of the old medieval architecture is left over, is still there. That is a real treat. And they're walking cities. The three Baltic countries are really famous for standing in circles for their kind of traditional music and traditional clothes. So they're united and standing in circles. I just think it's kind of a fun thing to think about in terms of their identity. Now, I do understand that each day on the ship, because you're on a much smaller ship, you're going to get talks about each one of the places. So that's going to add to a lot. I really hope when you leave Gdansk, I really hope someone gives you a talk with a calendar. I did look at getting in there once, and now like I just look fresh at the moment. Yeah, Koningsbrug, which was another Hanseatic town. I mean, all these towns, all the way up.
Video was memo.
They're just it's fascinating architecture and it's enjoyable. So you're going to be calling in because you're a small ship, able to get into these different places. So I'm presuming once you get up to Lithuania. Now, Lithuania, Poland, you may or may not know, leading up to World War II, had the largest Jewish population in Europe. You aware? And that's where
considered the new Jerusalem.
Well, the New Jerusalem, and interestingly, Lithuania had in the region the second or third largest Jewish population. And what happened? Are you familiar a little bit with Jewish history? I mean, everyone sort of is. The reason I want to mention that is so people often think, maybe the United Kingdom or England didn't have a great deal of anti-Semitism. You know that they actually expelled all the Jews from Britain in the 1200s? They rounded them up at Clifford's Tower in York and burnt them and kicked the other ones out. So when you get to Western and the center of Yiddish linguistic culture was this part of Europe. This is where Yiddish was really, really spoken. Once you get into the Jewish populations in what was the Soviet Union, I'm sure you've heard that Jews were accused of being money lenders and so forth. Well, they were, and I'll tell you why they were. They only were in Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, they were only farmers. But in Western Europe, they weren't allowed to. And so the very first ghetto is in which city? It's a neighborhood in Venice. And Venice was all trading, just like Hanseatic League. Ghetto was just the name of a neighborhood, and the Jews were allowed to live there and trade. So, the merchant of Venice. And so the Jewish role in Western Europe is if the lords or the kings and queens or whatever, as to finance the wars, needed to borrow money, as per old rules, old Christian rules that are still enforced in this town, you weren't allowed to be a moneylender. Jews were used as moneylenders because they fell under different rules. But if you didn't want to pay them back, you blamed them for all the problems in your society. And that's why they got wedged into different places. Lithuania, so they actually called for the expulsion of them from what is now Poland in several areas in the 16th century. Say Britain was more like the 1200s. So I mean, the Poles in Western, or the Jews in Western Europe had a terrible time. But as we do know, during World War II, 6 million Jews alone were killed. And places like Lithuania, Vilnius had big Jewish spots gone. I mean, they have a neighborhood, but they're gone. Now, if you meet any of your Jewish friends who are like generational Jews here in the United States, a disproportionate say they have roots in Lithuania. It was such a big percentage of the population there, and a big active culture. So that is some pretty heavy culture, pretty heavy history, and obviously Poland is where Auschwitz was, and that's all further south. But they're just interesting things to talk about versus what the societies look like today. And I do remember in Poland particularly because at the end of the Cold War, when the wall came down and the Soviet Union fell apart, a lot of the old thinking on this side of Europe, which had been compressed, had been held down by the Soviet system, was freed up. And I always remember it was very scary for anyone with Jewish roots because Lech Walesa, who seemed like he was a good man leading up the uprising against communism, but people would come to the town halls and say, well, if we vote for you, you promise to get rid of the Jews. Right? So that language is, that undercurrent has stuck around. So, it's just when you're visiting the cities, it's interesting to go and actually look for the Jewish neighborhoods. I'm hoping with your local guides and all that you get some of the talks about that because it adds a lot to it. In fact, you're in a small boat, hopefully you get some really good leadership. But you head over to Gdansk. By the way, if you're worried about rough water or anything, I think you'll hardly see any. I have crossed one time from Helsinki to Tallinn in a forced four gable. But that was in a hydrofoil. So like an hour and a half. That was not like the real hydrofoil, right? It's not about 100 people. I actually it's a fun story, so I'm sorry to tell a personal story, but I had a group with me from California, but they were Filipino Americans. And I remember that specifically because Filipinos, even though they come from an island country, apparently get seasick really easily. That's what they told me. Well, all 35 of them did, and I did too. And we get into Tallinn, now again, a little boat, you're going to be even bigger thing. We go across, bumping around, and I could see them staring at me with daggers. Like, how did you win? So when we got off the boat, I said, I don't care what you're doing. I'm not taking that boat back. I'm going to go book on the big ferry. And we come. And so we didn't get back till 1 o'clock in the morning. But it was duty free back then. Scandinavians, when they get on ships, drink like fish because everything's super expensive in Scandinavia. And so if it's the duty free is all gone in the European Union, but then they used to go and party it up. The Finns and the Estonians love to sit in saunas. The word sauna is a Finnish word, so a big part of their winter survival. But yeah, every one of these, like Riga, will be really lovely to see. About a third of the population of Latvia lives there. Nearly half of Tallinn lives there. I would love to. You'll go past some of these islands, and of course you're going in May, perfect. So it'll be light up. So make sure you're out on the ship to look at that. Apparently these cultures out there, one of these islands is still a traditional matriarchal society. Yeah. So there's just so much to read about when you're going up to there. So fascinating stuff. Tallinn, and the other good thing is all of these towns are walkable. Right? I mean, they've protected the historic centers. They're walkable. Then you're going to head up to beautiful Helsinki, which a bunch of you went to last year, but some of you haven't been.
Oh, well, we sleep there. We're allowed to see it.
Oh, you didn't? Oh, so you just kind of flew in and then you flew all the way up to Oh, did they? Oh, I didn't really, because I heard you guys loved Egypt, but it was because you went all the way up to Kirkenes, didn't you? Kirkenes. That's, if you don't know where that is, everyone, I just mentioned it because it's did you get a chance to see Kirkenes when you got up there?
Yeah.
But there's not much to see it, but it's the reason I pointed out is it's way up there. So it's a Norwegian town sitting on the Russian border, and you are like 300 miles north of the Arctic Circle. Like that is isolated living. They went down to the fjords. Like, it's such a beautiful trip. So this makes so much sense to get. But if you haven't seen Helsinki, so I have a lot of nice things to say about Helsinki. But one full day and you catch kind of the highlights. It's just a really interesting capital. Lovely, and you're getting to Luther actually when you're up there. So that shows up in the architecture, the beautiful cathedral. May I just ask everyone, it's 5 to 3. Did you need a facility break? Did you need to go to the restroom or anything? No. No. I mean, up to you, but this would be the time to go if we're going to take one. Should we just keep chatting? Okay. All right. I know I've already gone. Yeah. Oh. Oh, just a wee little bit. But yeah. So this whole area, obviously you've got gigantic St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg is a much younger city than the other ones. You probably know it was built by Peter the Great, moved everything up there. He wanted his Paris or Venice up in the north. But interestingly, again, this is the kind of trip, like, I mean, enjoy the beautiful scenery, walk the towns, but spend a long time reading about these places because they're fascinating. I've been to Viborg 4 times. That was Finland as well. So the border should have historically come straight down here. And this whole lake area is Karelia. And then around here, oh, that's the Swedish capital. And then Helsinki or Helsingfors became really the Suomi. They call themselves Suomi. They don't Finns at all, right? Their own language. So when you see it, the hockey teams, it says Suomi. You see them playing it. So Helsinki is about 500,000 people. But in the economic days, the colonial days, because it was all part of Russia, they're building this. This was a whole network of canals. But of course, life would have been fascinating because all winter everything froze. So you have a real distinct winter culture, a real distinct summer culture. And that's where it got in all these little towns, all these Finnish towns up here. That's where you've got a hole in the ice, jump in the ice, which those of you who follow me on Facebook, I do that. I cold plunge at home. I finally did one just after Christmas. It's minus 21 degrees outside. We go in the water but then they come out and get in their saunas. Try cold plunging. I still, when I'm traveling like this, I have a cold shower, I have a warm shower, and then the last minute. Anyway, I can, after when we're done, I can show you a video. It's fun. But Finland is just so interesting. So Estonia is so Estonia is really the cousin. But Estonia keeps itself pretty independent. Of course, the last couple of years have been tough because they're very difficult population for Russia. It has been very interesting academically to see polling from the Russian-speaking communities in those countries. Now, a lot of those people have moved elsewhere, but not all, of course. But to see a lot of the polling, because of course, these countries in the European Union have free, open, honest media. This country out here does not. Right? And so these Russians are actually getting news from these outlets and the international outlets about what's actually happening. And so even though you still see in Russia quite manipulated numbers, but all the support for Putin and that sort of thing, but of course you're not allowed to publish any news. The one guy running against him in the elections has been far from running. These ones are more and more siding with Ukraine. So it is interesting, just as, again, an academic kind of measure to say, okay, when the facts are on the table, it's not that all Russian-speaking people are going to side with Russia. They're pretty happy to be in these more open societies. But Estonia has become one of these countries. Someone else is doing it now. Japan, I think, where they've allowed virtual citizenship. You can actually, because these are places that have been losing population. So you can become like a digital citizen if you register your business there. And they've been watching, and I don't know, you have to Google it to learn more about it, but they've been watching how economies in these kind of places have done so well, making video games, that kind of thing, right? So they want people to count Estonia as their home for tax base or whatever, and it becomes a registered business there. So kind of offshore, but not really, because it's still, they're allowing, Malta's been playing that game, but yeah, they've just said something from Japan now. People can stay suddenly 6 months and work as long as they're not taking a Japanese job. So if you come and you're doing, working on your computer, that's so interesting set of stuff. So there's a lot to learn about each one. And now it's so much easier. Well, we have Wi-Fi, but really you sit and Google these places and talk to them. I find it so much the experience. And then when you do have the time, I'm a huge fan personally anytime a boat cruise, I try and be the first one home. I just think you get the town to yourself so much more. I say this, many of you have been to Skagway. Haven't you? Skagway, Alaska, the Alaska cruise, right? Like when I've had groups up there, I say, the minute we dock, we get off. Get to walk up Broadway before there's 8,000 people. Walk up a town of 800 people, you know? So you get up early, or, you leave it quite a bit later. The other thing is you're going to love the food on these ships, generally speaking. I always think it's so much fun in each one of these places to go out to a local place and buy some lunch. I just think it adds to the experience. You're going to talk to someone local. You're going to see what's on their menu, and the menus are all and then you get to try whatever their local specialties. So it's I try, and it's not that I love everything, but I am kind of a foodie because I travel so much. So I'll go and I'll look down the menu and I say, I don't know what that is. I'm allergic to mushrooms, so I always check on that. And then I'll say, okay, I'll try it. And if I don't like it, that's not on them, that's on me. It's done. But you can go back and then have your lovely 5-star cuisine on the boat. But I think that's fun. So so the crossing up here is really neat. See how close you are at the famous St. Petersburg. You're coming up to Helsinki. Then you're coming down to Visby down here. And Visby was also a Hanseatic town. I have been there. And I remember from where we docked, again, that's why you have the smaller ships. You get some of these little places that the big ships can't get there. Means that in a town, I think all of Visby is about 24,000 people. And it's so sweet. In front of everybody's house is a ballroom. So you're getting into Sweden. And then you're going to sail up. So that's kind of a neat. I don't know if they have a tour for you. I'm sure they do. But go to the lectures. They seem to have a lecture about each port coming up. And you will know almost immediately. Of course, you're with Shelley. She knows these things so well because, in terms of these ships, it's because some ships, I've made the mistake on big ships of going to a port lecture when it's someone telling you where you can go buy diamonds. Whereas, and that's why But these smaller ones where you actually have someone like me giving a talk, this is where we're tomorrow, then you have your kind of bucket list to hit. So that's fun. But what I really strongly encourage you, Stockholm's the end of your trip. So whatever time you're getting into Stockholm, it'll be light. Get out on deck. These islands are fantastic. Again, that's where ABBA lives, is out on those islands. They call it the archipelago. If it's nice weather, it's just such a treat to come in. And Stockholm's the kind of city you need to approach the water because for 99% of its history, it was all maritime. You drive across. I've done that drive a couple of times. It's just kind of marshy land, right? It's ugly, but it's just not like this is where Sweden's down. They're all these maritime places historically. And then if you do go in, great museums. And even if you're not a big museum person, they've got the boats, the Viking boats that they've reconstituted. You get to see really fascinating. And that kind of woodwork, it is spectacular. The distances they travel. We talked about it this morning as you were there. The Vikings were in Newfoundland. Right? They were in Greenland. They're incredible travelers. So Stockholm, I think you have one more day when you're in Stockholm, which is Stockholm you could spend a long time. Again, it's just such an interesting city, and you're going at the absolute best time of the year. The longer days, but it's still not crazy busy as July, August. They hand out Nobel Prizes there. But so Sweden, along with Finland, applied to join NATO, and they were blocked. Who blocked them?
Turkey.
Do you know why? Oh, money.
Some of the Turkish issues.
Absolutely, you're right. It's because a lot of the PKK lists in Sweden, talking about your earlier question about refugees and so forth, the PKK are the Kurdish nationals, the Kurdish Workers' Party. And we should just as a side have a lot of sympathy for the Kurds. You're familiar maybe with the Balfour Declaration. It was World War I. That's when the Jews were promised a homeland. Well, the Kurds were also promised a homeland. And that was Britain promising them so they would rise up against the Turkish Empire. But the Kurds never got one. And the Kurdish people are stuck between 5 countries. And I really like Turkey. I'm not forgiving and everything, but I really like Turkey. I'm not so keen on Syria, and Iran. And the Kurds have a pretty tough time with it. And they have been fighting them. But both, politically, but also violently. And that's what Erdogan said. He said, until you kick out anyone or give them back to us, you're not going to be allowed in. Something gave a few weeks ago. Suddenly, Sweden's just been allowed in. And I think because Turkey got promised going to take this. So something gave. So that means now all of the north of Europe is in NATO. Because it was amazing to think how big these places were, neutral countries. Right? I remember Sweden was neutral all through World War II. Now, Swedish education is excellent. Sweden's a very honest country. So the Swedes will be the first ones to tell you, yeah, we were neutral, made a huge amount of money selling iron ore to the Nazi regime. So, super honest about it. Whereas Norway, of course, which was invaded, has been a native country, but is not in the European Union. So, but that's what each one's story. And I do think, the trade-off always on the ships. You'd never do the solo trip if you didn't do a ship, just the nature of it. But each story is different. So it's fun to sit down, and hopefully their lectures are good, but then sit down and Google it yourself and read about it. And try to listen to a lot of music. Great. Sibelius was up in Helsinki. They have a beautiful monument. They're one of the great composers of all time. So, those of you from the music side, really lovely up there too. So that's, it's obviously recovering. I was looking forward to this talk, but it's also a vast area because each one of these things is kind of worth its own conversation. But why don't we just open it up a little bit to any questions or anything you'd like to go a little more into? Going way at the back first. There's a tour I haven't done.
Church underground that's
Oh, yes, sir. I've been in that church, yeah. Yeah, that's part of any city tour.
Center, the wastewater treatment down there.
Yes.
Like the church,
it absolutely does. It's so funny. I totally forgot about it. So when you get into the harbor, Helsinki, by the way, is also shipbuilding. All the giant cruise ships are built up there. Even though they have very high wages and everything, it's big business for them. So that's kind of neat. You'll see like a big carnival or something being worked on. But the main square is that beautiful white church that you see every single time you see a picture.
The roof is above ground, so that's light.
There you go. So that's the underground. There's the picture. That's the harbor that you come into. Very Lutheran, by the way. When you go inside, because it looks so beautiful, and it is beautiful, but you go inside, it's just one little cross, right? But they weren't as ornate, but that's a stadium. So I find that so interesting. So the harbor is just gorgeous. But yeah, the underground church is not a part of it. And I'm not you have a tour included. A Helsinki tour will include the inner harbor, the underground church. Here's the old port. This time of year, again, sailing into Helsinki, try and be out on deck because you come in through here, or leaving, try and be out on deck. It's just so beautiful. And they embrace sun. Some of my friends, I've never lived in them, traveled, but a good friend of mine from London, to be fair, so big city, he said he went to Helsinki for 6 months. He said after 2 months ago, he found it a little too small. Yeah, we come from smaller places, right? But if you're from big city Europe, it's maybe a little small. But yes, the acoustics in here are fantastic. You'll see that on a tour. A highlights tour of Helsinki is honestly about 3 hours because this is not a big city. It's well run. It's fun. They do have tramways up and down, and they have some that are actually now tram pubs. So you can hop on and have a beer and ride around the trails. That's a great idea. It's so that's a fun. I get a sense of it. Yeah, check out that language. So that's the underground temple church right there. Yes, that's a good question. What were you going to ask?
Just that at one time, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, it was all one country. Why they had the 3 crowns and Swedish.
Yeah, and they have their hockey jerseys too, the Triple Crowns. Yeah, that's right. So that was gradually sorry. Yeah, when you take the 3 countries, they kept basically Sweden, which is they're summer palace, but Sweden, which is considered such a kind of lovely, progressive, educated society. They had a king back in the 1400s, and they had quite a big empire. And this guy was nuts. I mean, he used to slaughter sheep for fun, and he basically attacked everyone. He tried to go all the way down to Constantinople, right, and just decimated Sweden. And that's when it kind of breaks down, and that's where Norway then becomes part of the Danish crown. Sweden was kind of on its own. trying to hang on to Finland, but gradually losing Finland to Russia. So do some Swedish history, because for just kind of, I mean, when you think about Sweden, you just kind of think warm thoughts of it, don't you? You know, but they had this very rough period in those early days. And you know, it's interesting if you want to climb back into history a little further. You've presumably quite a few of you have been to Normandy to go see the American beaches, for example. Yeah, I was there most recently in June this year. Down there, Canada, right there. So the American beaches are just kind of right there. That's where Utah. You know, it's just if you haven't been yet, make sure you go in your life because it's so moving. You know, and I always, of course, go to the Canadian beaches when I'm there too. My grandfather, he survived, unfortunately, but to all of that. But this, the reason I'm mentioning all of this, how it's relevant to our broader story, is this area, what is now Normandy. So Brittany is Celtic. You know what I mean when I say Celtic? Irish, Welsh. Right? So they're the Celts. Out here in Brest, they still actually speak Clipon, which is kind of like Old Welsh. But this was not really France. These were the Vikings. So the Vikings, because they were so good at shipbuilding, and they were really poor at farming in Norway because there were so little farms, there are these big fjords, they kept leaving. So the Normans are the reason I am speaking to you in English right now. So the Vikings came across, and they came across from about three main areas. So up in Bergen, that coast down there, the Friesland Islands, which is this part of northern Germany and to the Netherlands, and then Jutland. You know who came out of Jutland? The Angles and the Saxons. So Anglo-Saxon comes from there. They come over, and I mentioned York to you earlier. They go and settle Jovik. And Jovik, there's the city of York. So Leeds, big industrial old Britain. York, beautiful historic. That's where, again, King Constantine or Emperor Constantine was crowned. Emperor of the the Roman Empire goes down and founds Constantinople. People, like, it's amazing to know it was like way up here. Then the Vikings come in and settle Jovik. So they're up there, gradually start to take over Britain, which is pretty interesting because Britain at that time would have spoken, even like St. Patrick, would have spoken a weird kind of Latin dialect that would have been mixed with Roman, with Gaelic. Yeah. And be Welsh. Scottish is closer to Irish. It was Welsh. And that's why the Welsh ended up over here. They pushed them out. Well, then he has a fight back and forth with his cousin, because it's all related, with the king who was down here in Normandy, and makes him a promise they don't come through. It's the Bayeux Tapestry, and the Normans invade Britain. And it's the last time Britain was ever invaded. 1066, the Battle of Hastings. Right? William the Conqueror was a Viking by origin who was the vassal king of Normandy here. They invade Britain, go up to Londinium, take it over, and of course it takes a long time, but they establish themselves. They bring over this Norman language, which fuses with the local language, and that's how the English language comes to be. And it's fascinating. You know, English is a very good colonial language because even if you mispronounce something, you still kind of understand it. So many of them, like Finnish, if you say it backwards, they'll stare at you. You know, and there's so many languages like that. Whereas English, we have so many double words for things. So even though we're Germanic as a language, 60% of the words in English are Latin. But all of that ties back to that movement out of these regions you're going to, where they spread out in all the different regions. So that effect is huge. So the Celts migrated up what is now Portugal, Galicia, Scotland, and the Vikings came down. This is all starting about 3,000 years ago, where there's this population boom. Must have been a warming. And then the Vikings had a really bad time in the 1300s. That was the mini ice age in Europe. You've probably heard about this. But I mean, a third of Europe almost starved in some of those winters. And that's what wiped out the Vikings in Greenland and Newfoundland and those sort of areas because they just couldn't farm and survive anymore. But this is all very productive woodland, which is why France, of course, built up such a big empire. And then as you go east into just east of where you will be, again, up, you wouldn't feel very familiar if you went upland in Finland because it would feel very much like the lake country as you go north of here, right? Up to the middle of the state and up into northern Ontario there. Very, very familiar kind of area. So the population is already small, but you have to get from kind of St. Petersburg down towards Moscow before you start to get good agricultural land here. And you know where the breadbasket of the world is ostensibly? Ukraine, exactly. Do you know where it is right now? The Canadian prairies. Yeah, it's the only other huge place in the world that produces enough grain for the world. So there's a reason why you have those big population centers. But all of these, and this is why, it'd be so fun to explore some of these little communities around. But really, with one important exception, which I don't think you're going to get to, Vilnius is way in, but it's all of these towns that you go to on the trips. They're the ones that are that Hanseatic community. Like, look at it. And that's the port you're going to in Lithuania there. Yeah, just, lovely and fun. And everything's kind of on a smaller scale up there, except for Stockholm. Stockholm feels pretty big and impressive and international, but these nice little places. So, yeah, I think it's a gorgeous trip. And it ties in if you went to Norway last year for sure. In the past, this trip would have gone to St. Petersburg, but it was and it's really interesting going there because, of course, it was a maritime city. And because, St. Petersburg was there, do you know what the other big Russian port is in this area? It's a place, it is on my list to go, just to have done it for next, way up there. And that is way above the Arctic. That's the largest city in the world above the Arctic Circle. And that is where I've met American submariners on trips before. One gentleman, 5 trips with me, he said he was in that. Like, the old days, Cold War days, they'd sail in, you weren't allowed to eat with metal forks in case you drop it, same thing. But they were right in the harbor. That's a nuclear port there. That is why the Russians first tried to invade, or the Soviets, Afghanistan. They were trying to get down to a warm port. And everybody's learned to don't invade Afghanistan. But yeah, otherwise they had nothing out there. Not until you get all the way to the other side of the country with Vladivostok. But that's so far away, it's not tied in. But once you sort of climb into this Nordic region up there, I just find it so fun. So, there's a million things to leave you with, but both that in a European sense, you're in a less populated area. But when you, as we started with at the beginning of our talk, if you look at it in a North American sense, it's millions of people living like in a place that gets really, really dark in the wintertime. You're going in May and seeing the midnight sun. Now, don't get too excited about the Northern Lights because it'll be dark from about 2 to 3 in the morning. Right? So that's where you want to go back in the winter for that. And a lot of people go to Northern Lights in the winter, although Iceland's quite rainy. So the place to really go is Fairbanks, Alaska, Yellowknife, Northwest Territories. Yes, sir.
Oh, I just wanted to point out that Poland and Lithuania had common history for 400 years. The first 200, the Lithuanian king and his family ruled Poland. And then when that dynasty died out, they decided to have a union of nobles. And so that was another 200 years until Russia, Prussia, and Austria divided up.
Basically carved up Poland particularly. Lithuania was stayed slightly more independent. But Poland was basically carved up with the expansion of Prussia. Now, German unification is really linked. You probably read the history of Bismarck a little bit, kind of masterminded the unification of Germany. But what really leads to World War I is Germany was so late to the game to get together that you had these big blocs. French Empire, the British Empire, Austro-Hungary was busy fighting itself the whole time. They weren't getting on. And then Russia, of course, was this massive thing that most Russians didn't have a say in. They were tied to the land. So you had these big trading blocks, and then Germany unifies. And they did actually have an empire. I don't know if you're aware of this. There's a few countries in Europe. Namibia, it was French actually. That was German West Africa. Togo, little tiny Togo. And that's why when you get into that, and this is why like colonialism, but you get into this part of Europe here, you see all these tiny little countries? British, German, French, right? And what were they all about? Buying people, right? Oh, and Portuguese. Some of the poorest countries we saw, they're all just slave imports. Now, remember, the Europeans couldn't get inland in Africa for years and years and years because the horses get from diseases. And so they built these ports along the coast, Ivory Coast, Cote d'Ivoire. That's Nestle. It's all chocolate and that sort of thing. And chocolate actually comes from Mexico. So, but the Germans started to get into their empire, as did the Italians, right? Somalia was an Italian one, and they tried to invade Ethiopia, 1933.
And into the Rwanda, Burundi area.
Yeah, well, the Rwanda, that's tragic. We're getting off subject a little bit now, but the Democratic Republic of Congo, that had belonged basically to the King of Belgium. Like it was his own little fief.
Not full of the king.
Yeah, I know, it belonged directly to the King of Belgium. And then it was eventually handed over to the Belgian state. When they get independence after World War II, there were fewer than 20 university-educated Congolese. They figure half the population. They literally, for 180 years, just took all the wealth of them. So it's, I just, obviously I'm a historian, but I find that stuff just so important to remember because when you get to different places, like I'm in Madrid in April, and I love Madrid, love the city. But when you see all the great big buildings, and then you go over to Panama, to Portobello, that's where all the gold left, the silver left in South America, one little wooden church. Right? There's someone paid all those big buildings, So that's pretty fascinating. But countries like Finland and Estonia, interesting little things because they weren't empires, right? And that's why they have such a kind of pride in their own thing, and they care about their own thing. But more and more, when you poll the youth around so much of Europe now, a good third don't tend to identify with their national country as much as they used to. They tend to call themselves European. So that's the trend that's happening. And it's an interesting thing to talk about. And of course, down here, Serbia is still in a funny relationship, of course, because it has a relation with Russia. But really, all like Montenegro, the next country to join the European Union, because Croatia just joined. Britain overall is totally regretting Brexit. It's just been disastrous for the economy and all sorts of problems. So those kind of anti-European things have pretty much fallen apart because they watched Britain go through it. France is having a bit. But up north, these guys were a bit later to the game, right? Like Finland used to have the marka, they have their own currencies. They took a long time to sign on to the common currencies. Most of the places probably would take euros, although you'd still have I don't think they're using the euro yet. I don't think they are. But everywhere you can pay euros or local currency. Dollars you don't want as much. Like they want euros, which is fine. They're just about the same value. The euro 2 days ago was stronger than the U.S. So the dollar was about 93 euro cents. From a technical point of view, life is things I like about traveling in this part of the world. Aside from being beautiful and interesting, but so often a price is a price. It's something that I think is really frustrating tourism in North America. Yeah, you come from somewhere where you're used to just seeing price, and you come over, well, just about anywhere here, and you say, okay, I'd like a hamburger, and then on it is a local tax, state tax, and then most of us tip 20% these days. It's not that I'm not paying that. I just rather see that that's the price, right? So you certainly can leave tips, but it's not required like 20% or anything like that. So it's just kind of easy to calculate when you see a price. That's we're actually over here. We're the exceptional that way. Frustrating, It's we had when we had the Olympics in Vancouver, it really caused, like Vancouver is one of the most expensive cities in the world. It caused some real tension between foreign visitors because the staff, the wait staff, that's how they earn their living. Absolutely, we understand that. But again, if you come from a country, it's just not part of it, And I mean, I remember Toronto, there used to be a point, if you had a glass of wine, you actually had 3 taxes on it: liquor tax, provincial tax, and federal tax, and then a tip. So your $10 or $12 glass of wine is $18. Well, I would rethink that glass of wine at that point, So at least when you're up there, if you look at something that kind of looks expensive to you, that's what you can pay. So I think we should be lobbying our governments to have inclusive pricing. We did it with airlines. Remember? You used to see a price and everything. Now they have to show you what the price is. So that could be a really easy anyway. That's my little soapbox about travel. And right now, European tour companies are coming less to North America than they used to because they're finding it so expensive over here. So that's well, it's a reality. And of course, the hotels and the national parks and everything become so expensive that it really is a challenge for them. So that's an interesting side. But food, think seafood, and then think, meat will really, you'll see everything on the menus, of course, but I would expect the ship will live up to that, like if you're trying things from different regions. Usually the smaller ships will go to the markets and get things. That's really fun. So, like I say, I like the little open face sandwiches that you get up in that part of the world that usually are different fish things. If you really don't eat fish, you will find meat everywhere, And up in Stockholm and Finland will take a bit of work, but you'll for sure find menus some caribou from far north, from the Sami people. It's nice. Yeah, it's big. It tastes like that's really fun.
Lithuania and Latvia, you might find things like wild boar.
Yeah, you will see boar, absolutely. Boar in Lithuania, Latvia, and sheep, of course, lamb. Do you eat much lamb here in Michigan?
Yeah.
Yeah, you just don't see it as much, do you? Because we see it more. But my dad say he was Irish sea lamb, and he's there. But my dad grew up in New Zealand, so their main meat was lamb, right? So I really like the lamb. That's just kind of fun. But, so by the way, service is good, but in these countries can be, particularly the Western ones, can be remarkably slow. You think of these countries as being so efficient. So Germany is. I mean, Germans have a short work week, right? A 33 or 35-hour work week, but German productivity is among the highest, if not the highest in the world. Like Germans, just when they go to work, they work really hard. And I tip my hat and respect them for it. And that's part of the reason their economy was so well. Unemployment is virtually nothing. Germany's 80 million people. But Denmark, Sweden, there's a little bit, we think of them as such advanced places. But there's a little bit of that, like, life's good. I don't have to try too hard. I mean, I was in a hotel in Copenhagen, like a four-star hotel in the center. And I had just checked in with a group. And often I just have bags because you get on it. But there was another group there. And the woman's like, well, yeah, I'll take your bags, but I go now. Now there's nobody else. And I remember this. No, I try and get through my life without raising my voice at anyone. But I remember whoever the lady was leading the group, she was just beside herself. And they're like, oh, no, because I take a break from 2 to 3. Okay. So there is that element of Scandinavia. I kind of like it too, though, in its own way, where just, like, come on, relax. And Scandinavians, so Finns kind of have a reputation for not having a sense of humor. I think they do. Super competitive society, right? One of the sports up there is wife carrying. So they put their wife on their back and they run an obstacle, right? And they have boot tossing, and people have been busted taking performance enhancing drugs. They're super competitive society. Now, the Swedes, the Danes, great sense of humor, also extremely well trained. So you get chatting to people, and you can quite easily say, where are you from? You can tell them Michigan. And you might say, oh, I did a semester there when I was in grade 16. Like when I was 19, I did a year at the Sorbonne in Paris, which was a good thing to have on my resume. But I had a bunch of Scandinavians I became friends with. Whereas, my parents helped a lot, and I saved my pennies, and I worked at a restaurant for a year to pay for it. These ones are all on scholarships from the governments. They're like, oh, we're going out for dinner tonight. Want to come? I'm like, no, I can't afford it. So you have that kind of relaxed system as well. Now, again, on the Eastern countries, people have been going back to Poland. Because Poland, for a big country and a big population, had a massive outflow, and particularly overwhelmingly to the UK and Ireland. And that played into the Brexit stuff, right? They wanted to leave because they were wanting to get a hold of immigration. But it's interesting now because now they have even though the economy is getting weaker, they just don't have enough people to do different jobs. But 1 million Poles came over, and then you've got waves from Romania and Bulgaria, all the countries you can suspect. Romania, Moldova is the poorest country in Western Europe. But tons of Poles went over for a long time. It's been 20 odd years. Now they're starting to go back, which is great news because it means they're bringing money back into Poland, reinvesting as things within the union are becoming more equitable. So that's been interesting to watch that ever for a long time. And yeah, and Poland has had some pretty heavy internal political struggles because so many of the youth left. You had this very kind of a group, more I guess you'd sort of say conservative. I don't like to use that word, but a group that was, a little more anti-modernization, a lot of the rules in Europe. Now the youth are coming back in, they've been standing up to the old regime. So Poland's looking kind of balanced in terms of political debate and so forth. And the three Baltic states, I think, have calmed down now. But at the start of Ukraine, they were the ones. Oh, there's people alive today who remember being invaded by the Soviet Union. So, that played a big role for all of them. Estonia, not that you get a sense of it, but Tallinn for a long time, right after it became independent, in the early 90s there. This is kind of not a particularly nice story I'm going to tell you, but it actually had the highest rate of HIV in all of Europe because it became a place for like stag parties and stuff because it was so cheap and fun. But obviously, with that in those early days, I think all of that's really changed now. That's not. I can see you two standing up. It's not the thing to end on, but it was one of the fun things about living in Europe. Like, I love where one bummer about where is everything's far away. Right? It took me a full day of travel just to get here. But if you live in any bigger cities, everything's on a 2 hours flight. And there's these budget airlines like Ryanair, shoved in like that, but for $20. And you do these weekend getaways. So one thing that I really loved from my years in Europe, because you'd say, let's go to Estonia this week. Let's go to Gdańsk this week. That's how so many Europeans get to see all of these things, because it's so easy just to hop around, right? Whereas you're closer, but Detroit to New York still going to cost you $500 or $600 and then your hotel, So, but they can get away for these weekends. But hey, we are at time, but do you have any other questions or anything? Feel free. So I've got your full itinerary here, but it does say that each day you have a lecture, so I think that will really add to it. So I'll see hopefully many of you the rest of the week here. So it's nice to connect. Now you've got me thinking. I'm going to Albania in a couple of weeks. I'm actually going to Venice, but then I've got some free time in a few days because I still haven't been to Albania. And then I think I will have been to everywhere. Oh, that's not true. I've been in Moldova. So kind of neat stuff. But I love going up there in the summertime. All right, ladies and gentlemen. 3 talks today. My voice might rest. I don't know what it made it sound. Yeah. I did kind of, yeah.